Welcome back. A story developing at this hour from Virginia about the state's governor, Ralph Northam. The governor's medical school confirms to NBC News that Northam's 1984 yearbook page contains an image of two men in racist attire. One is in blackface and the other in Ku Klux Klan robes. We're going to show you the image from the newspaper, and I warn you, the photo is offensive. NBC News has not confirmed the identity of the two people in the photo. Obviously, it implies that one of them is Governor Northam, but we've not confirmed that. We have reached out to Governor Northam's office for comment. Panel is back. Yamiche Alcindor, Howard Fineman, Ramesh Ponnuru. A couple of statements out here. I believe we have a statement from the Virginia Republican Party. If we can put up that on the board, which essentially says if this is true, then he should consider resigning. Let me read it here. Jack Wilson. If Governor Northam appeared in blackface or dressed in a KKK robe, he should resign immediately. Yamiche Alcindor, is this going to be something that Democrats are likely, many Virginians, is this something that he can survive politically or not?
I think it's going to be very hard for him to survive this politically because it was 1984. This is not something that was far, far in the future or far, far in the history. This is something that happened in a pretty modern era where it was very well known that you shouldn't appear in blackface, where it was very understood that the KKK was basically a domestic terrorist organization that was killing and pillaging communities. So I think the governor has a lot to explain here if that is him in a blackface or that is him in a KKK robe. And I think that Democrats on the Democratic side, they're going to have to feel the pressure of what to say about this, because we know that Democrats have definitely spoken out when Republicans have had the same sort of issues.
And in fact, Ramesh Ponnuru, I believe the now former Secretary of State of Florida, basically was Secretary of State for a day, essentially, and had to resign when photos of him in blackface showed up.
Yes. Governor Northam hasn't put out a statement yet. He's going to need a good explanation, and it's frankly hard to come up with what one would be.
His only way of surviving this, Howard, is if somehow those are not him.
Yes, and I would mention two words here: Doug Wilder. Don't forget that Doug Wilder was the first African-American governor in the South in modern times. If not,
are you implying he could either save or not save Ralph Northam with one statement?
No, I'm agreeing with Yamiche here. I'm just saying that he was governor in the 80s.
He was elected 5 years after this picture.
Yeah, I mean, so he was a major figure in the 80s in Virginia.
And he was actually a year before he's elected lieutenant governor.
Yeah, he was lieutenant governor.
And that was a groundbreaking election. Yeah. As the first African-American statewide office.
So actually the history of Virginia had already moved a way, way far distance from the old resistance of the 60s. So in the historical context, if the pictures are true, it's inexcusable.
The lieutenant governor is an African-American from Northern Virginia named Justin Fairfax. And in fact, Yamiche, it wasn't very long ago that he refused it. He presides over the state Senate. They did a tribute to Robert E. Lee, and he had walked out. So I would imagine that the Virginia Democratic leaders are going to have a hard time standing by Ralph Northam in this, considering they're walking out of protests. They're walking out in protest on commemorations of Robert E. Lee.
I think it's going to be very hard for the Democrats in Virginia not to come out very hard and say that this is unacceptable. And I think that when we look at where we are in this country with hate crimes rising, with racial divisions widening, I just think that the Democratic Party here in Virginia is not going to be able to stick by the governor if he is in fact these people and is in fact one of those people that are in blackface or in a KKK robe.
And I got to think in a presidential race, here's the thing. If Virginia Democrats don't step up, I mean, we just had a big segment here about the fight for African-American support. Presidential candidates are going to step up.
Well, in another context of the current life we're in, think of what's happened in terms of the Me Too movement as well. And we've seen a lot of politicians, including, I would mention, Al Franken, who some people in his family and his defenders and his friends said, hey, wait a minute. Let's wait here. Let's not jump to any conclusions. Let's not demand the kind of justice that a lot of other people thought had been denied for a long time. That things move fast now.
Yeah, they do.
They move fast, and if hours go by without him giving an explanation, it also adds to the likelihood that it's true. And he's out.
And it's hard to do the youth thing. This is medical school. It's hard to do the youth thing. He had already been at VMI. There's just, I'm sitting here wondering, what is any explanation he could grasp? Oh, I was young and irresponsible, or...
Which Senate Minority Leader Richard Sasslaw is trying to do in his behalf, and I do not believe it will work.
It just doesn't smell right on this one. This is never mind. He had already had his own controversy having to do with abortion. That is a polarizing issue left and right. I didn't think that was going to be as politically... This is much different here. This feels like this is going to be something that is... that he may not be able to survive the weekend. I mean, Yamiche, is this something that could happen that fast?
I think that could completely happen that fast. I think we live in an age where we now all have I think, collectively decided blackface and KKK robes are unacceptable.
Yeah.
And if you did that as a young medical student, that you should not be fit to be a governor of any state. So I think in some ways it's going to be a very quick justice if this is in fact him.
I have to say, if this is real, it makes you wonder, how did both Tom Perriello's campaign and Ed Gillespie's campaign never discover this, let alone any of us reporting on him? Yamiche, Howard, Ramesh, thank you all. We'll be right back. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.